Give me a second, I didn't practice getting all out of all this. I can just imagine this up on the YouTube channel. The Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 5th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. And then he began to speak, and he taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Please be seated. Impeachment. We've certainly heard that word a lot these past few weeks and months, haven't we? Probably enough for a lifetime even. Now the word impeach, in a general sense, simply means to charge someone with doing something wrong. It comes from a Latin word meaning to catch or entangle. And furthermore, it can be used in one of two ways. For instance, it can mean to cast doubt on someone's character. So, for example, a lawyer could try to impeach the credibility of a witness in order to discredit whatever that person said. A police officer was once being cross-examined by a defense attorney during a felony trial. Again, the lawyer was trying to undermine the policeman's credibility. Officer, did you see my client fleeing the scene of the crime? Asked the defense attorney. No, sir, replied the police officer, but I subsequently observed a person matching the description of the offender running several blocks away. And who provided that information? An officer who had originally responded to the scene. So a fellow police officer provided the description of this so-called offender. Tell me, do you trust your fellow officers? Yes, sir, with my life. With your life. Let me then ask you this, officer. Do you have a room at the station where you change from your street clothes into your uniform prior to your shift? Yes, sir, we do. And do you have a locker in that room? Yes, sir, I do. And do you have a lock on your locker? Yes, sir. Now, why is it, officer, that if you trust your fellow officers with your life, that you still find it necessary to lock your locker in a room that you share with these very same police officers? And without pausing, the officer immediately responded, well, you see, sir, we share the building with the court complex, and sometimes lawyers have been known to take a shortcut through our locker room. And with that, the entire congregation erupted into laughter. Needless to say, a prompt recess to the proceedings had to be called. On another occasion, I got this one from an article online entitled 50 of the Most Hilarious Things That Court Reporters Have Ever Heard. The attorney, trying to impeach a medical examiner, said, Doctor, before you performed the autopsy, did you check for a pulse? No. Did you check for blood pressure? No. Did you check for breathing? No. And so then it is possible that the patient was still alive when you began the autopsy? No. How can you be so sure, doctor? Well, because his brain was sitting on my desk in a jar. I see, said the lawyer, quickly trying to respond to this unexpected revelation. But could the patient have still been alive nevertheless? Well, yes, I suppose it is possible that he could have still been alive without a brain, if he was practicing law, that is. Of course, the second way the word impeach can be used, and the way we've heard it being used in recent days, is to specifically charge someone, especially a high government official like a federal judge or senator, even president, of a crime or against some other sort of improper conduct or behavior while in office. And it's that sense of the word impeach that applies to our reading this morning from the book of Micah. You see, the context or setting for this morning's reading from Micah is a courtroom, figuratively speaking, of course. In fact, this was apparently a rather common device often used by the prophets to dramatize any conflict or controversy between God and his people. And so Micah 6, 1-8 is not an exception at all or unusual in that respect. As the reading begins, God, acting here as the prosecutor, is challenging the people of Israel. Rise, plead your case, says God. And sitting in the jury box, we are told, are, as John Hulbert has put it, the vast mountains of the earth and the hills that have stood the test of time. In other words, creation itself stands ready to render judgment in this case of impeachment or wrongdoing against God's people. And God then continues, hear you mountains, the controversy of the Lord, and you enduring foundations of the earth, for the Lord has a controversy with his people, and he will contend with Israel. And then God turns back to the defendants, O my people, what have I done to you? In what have I wearied you? Answer me. It's a request full of anguish, isn't it? Basically, God is asking here, is it something I did? Is it my fault that you've gone bad and done what is evil? Without waiting for an answer or an excuse, God continues, for I brought you up from the land of Egypt and redeemed you from the house of slavery. In other words, I have delivered and defended and cared for you. Why do you now treat me like this when I have only had your best interests at heart all this time? Notice here how God is slowly building his case against them by reminding them of all that he's done for them. And I sent before you Moses and Aaron and Miriam. In other words, the two brothers and their sister, who you may recall, stood up to Pharaoh and then led the Israelites to freedom and ultimately the promised land. Resuming the history lesson, God then refers briefly to the evil schemes of the Moabite king Balak, who, thinking that he would curse Israel, found himself thwarted by the magician Balaam, who was led by God to pronounce a blessing instead. And this is followed by a reference to Shittim and Gilgal, which were locations associated with that crossing of the Jordan River into the land of promise after the Exodus. Once again, the point here is that God has always protected and prospered them. So why would they now treat him as they do? It can't be God's fault. Therefore, it must be theirs. Now we have to stop here for a second and take a moment to review the charges that are being brought against the Israelites by God. For one thing, Micah informs us elsewhere that their religious leaders have been accused of false prophecy. And for another, the wealthy and the elite are guilty of political oppression, economic exploitation against the weak and powerless. Some things never change, do they? Their hands are skilled to do evil, the official and the judge ask for a bribe, and the powerful dictate what they desire. Thus they pervert justice, says God, according to Micah. And going back to our reading, it's at this point in verse 6 that the people now have a chance to respond to these charges. But notice something interesting here. The guilty party, now on the witness stand, does not admit to that guilt, do they? I guess that hasn't changed either. Nor do they even ask for forgiveness or leniency. What do they do instead? How do they respond? They actually try to open up, well, a negotiation, don't they? In other words, they're ready and willing, even anxious, it appears, to settle this dispute out of court, so to speak. Once again, sound familiar? What do you want, God? They ask. Perhaps there's something wrong with our worship and praise. Okay, we'll fix it. Or is it something else? Just name it. Maybe you want burnt offerings, or year-old calves, or thousands of rams, or tens of thousands of rivers of oil. Say no more, they're yours. No, not enough. How about my firstborn in exchange for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my life? Is that it? Is that what you want? You've got it. Consider it done. In other words, like in so many instances even today, Micah here is depicting the people of Israel as looking for a price, isn't he? A price to be paid to make this all go away. What's it going to take? How much? But it won't work here, will it? God will not be bought off so quickly or so easily. Indeed, not at all. There'll be no out-of-court settlement, no mere financial penalty to be paid, no way to wriggle out of a guilty verdict or to avoid admitting it. It turns out that God doesn't want any of these things. God is not here to negotiate any terms, good or otherwise. For example, worship is not your problem. It's not more money or better sacrifices either. You want to know what God requires? Very well, I'll tell you. But who's talking at this point? Is it still God? Not likely, given how verse 8 begins. He's told you, O mortal, what is good, that he, of course, is God. So it can't be God speaking then. Is it the jury, those mountains and hills of verses 1 and 2? Again, not very likely either. It's not really appropriate for the jury to speak out like this at trial. Then who is it? Well, there's really only one possibility left, isn't there? That is, it's the prophet Micah himself. And presumably the author of this dramatized courtroom scene. And that's the whole point, isn't it? Everything leading up to this final verse, verse 8, this whole trial between God and his people being depicted here has been building towards this climactic moment. And Micah now brings resolution to this legal proceeding. Again, it's Micah who now speaks, certainly on behalf of God, of course, but it's almost as if he's also kind of the defense attorney as well, who with laser-like precision is focusing in on just what's at stake here. And in a sense, advising his clients what they really need to do to resolve this dispute with God. So he quite simply tells the people what God actually requires, indeed what their religious faith requires. Now we're all familiar with legal requirements, aren't we? If you want to drive a car, you are legally required to have a driver's license. If you want to drive that car out of your driveway and onto the highway, you are legally required to obtain a license and registration for that vehicle. And you're also legally required to have insurance on it as well. And so we're all familiar with legal requirements then. And therefore, when Micah says to the Israelites, what does the Lord require of you? He's not talking about bits of advice or mere suggestions here, is he? He's talking about expectations, plain and simple, non-negotiable expectations. But yet at the very same time, he's not simply talking about legal requirements here either. James Howell, senior pastor of Myers Park United Methodist Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, talks about the subtle nuances of the Hebrew word darash. As he knows, the English word require kind of misses the heart of it. When we use it, he says we typically resort to notions of rules or grading. In contrast, the word darash has undertones of affection, he says, or the healthiest sort of dependency, as in the child requires his mother's love, or this flower requires rain and sunshine. There's also the sense of seeking in darash as well, says Howell. So when the Lord requires something, it isn't so much that God insists on or demands these things. Instead, it's that God seeks them, even yearns for them, he says. In other words, what God requires is not really a legal mandate or expectation at all, but rather simply a desire to be in relationship with us and for us. And for us in turn, rather, to imitate God in our dealings with each other and with the world. And so what is it that God requires of us, that God seeks and yearns for from us? Just three things, it turns out. Three simple things. To do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with our God. Above everything else, the most important thing that God seeks and yearns from us and for us is justice. And yet, James Howell again reminds us that this justice isn't mere fairness or rewarding good and punishing evil. Instead, it's all about community and ensuring that everyone has what they need. And therefore, God isn't just insisting that the police and judges be fair. Rather, God is inviting all of us to see that everyone is taken care of in our society, especially the poor, the neglected, and the marginalized. That everyone has their rights and their property protected from those who would take it from them. That everyone has a voice that will speak up for them when they need it the most. As Edward Marquardt has pointed out, there are 9 words that are associated with the word justice in the Bible, just 9 words. And those 9 words are, he says, widow, fatherless, orphan, poor, hungry, stranger, needy, weak, oppressed. In other words, biblical justice will always intervene and rule on behalf of those who are in need. That is, the weak among us, who need the strong to stand up for them and to speak out for them. In the horror that was the Holocaust, incidentally, the annual Holocaust Remembrance Day was just celebrated this past Monday. One of the most horrific things that occurred was that people, Good people, people of faith even, did not speak out against the Nazis on behalf of those who were being persecuted by them. And afterwards, confessing his own complicity in what took place, Martin Niemöller, a German Lutheran pastor, wrote this powerful, now famous poem. First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. As Martin Luther King Jr. once said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. What does the Lord require of you, asks Micah? To do justice, to stand up for those who are weak. And then to love kindness. Someone once said anyone can be a heart special. The only requirement is loving somebody. The Hebrew word here is hesed. Hesed is a difficult word to translate because it stands for a whole cluster of ideas. Love, mercy, grace, kindness. It can even be said that it wraps up in itself all the positive attributes of God. Hesed is also then what motivates someone to act for the benefit of someone else without ever once considering what's in it for me. In other words, it's not transactional, to use a word we hear a lot these days. That is, it doesn't say, if you do this for me, then I'll do something for you. No, Hesed says instead, without your even asking, without absolutely no expectation of reciprocity or returning the favor, I will simply do this kind or loving thing for you. To do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. As Edward Marquardt reminds us, focus here on the word walk. Walk implies slow. Walk implies measured. Walk is the opposite of running, he says. And now focus on the word humbly, says Marquardt, not full of yourself, not preoccupied with yourself. Or as someone else once said, I think this means that we don't have all the answers. We respect God's wisdom and look to God for guidance and direction. Well, according to our reading, at least the case is now closed. The court is now adjourned. The verdict has been rendered. In the matter of God versus his people, the people are found guilty as charged. In the impeachment of God's people, they and we are guilty of not truly understanding what God requires of us. Justice, not merely worship. To love kindness, not simply our own wants and desires. And finally, to walk humbly with our God, not running around like we already know it all, but slowly, patiently, deliberately walking with God, listening to his word, and following in his ways. But here's the thing, instead of receiving a sentence, we've been given a pardon instead. An outline of how to act, how to correct our corrupt ways, how to follow God faithfully. And so now it's our job to make all of our remaining days count to the glory of God and to further the work of his kingdom. The prophet Micah has argued our case and has shown us the way. Even TV's Perry Mason couldn't have done it better. Amen.